There's a particular kind of pain that no one talks about at dinner parties, the kind that doesn't have a clean name and doesn't show up on any diagnostic chart. It's the pain of watching yourself, almost from the outside, make a decision you know is wrong. Delay the email you should send, talk yourself out of the opportunity that finally arrived. Choose the smaller life when the larger one was right there, hand extended, waiting. And the strangest part, the part that makes it so isolating, is that this tends to happen most often, not to the people who lack intelligence, but to the ones who have it in excess, the people who read the books, who understood the lecture before the professor finished the sentence, who were told again and again growing up that they were gifted. This is the quiet catastrophe of the intelligent mind, not failure from ignorance, but failure from a kind of knowing that becomes its own trap. To understand why this happens, you have to go somewhere most psychology content refuses to go. Not to the symptom, the procrastination, the self-doubt, the pattern of quitting just before the finish line, but to the architecture underneath. Because self-sabotage in smart people is not a bug in the system. It is the system doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting something that feels far more important than success. And until you understand what it's protecting and why, no amount of habit stacking or morning routine optimization is going to touch it. Start with the brain itself. The human nervous system was not built for achievement. It was built for survival. And those are not the same thing. Every risk your intelligent mind perceives, and it perceives more of them than average. Because that's what high cognition does. It maps consequences with extraordinary precision, triggers the same ancient circuitry that your ancestors used when they heard something move in the grass at night. The amygdala does not distinguish between a predator and a career pivot. It reads uncertainty and it pulls the alarm. What psychologists call anticipatory anxiety is, in a very literal sense, your brain running a simulation of the future and deciding before anything has happened that the pain of failure is too vivid and too real to risk. And the smarter you are, the more detailed that simulation, the more convincing the case your own mind makes for staying still. This is the first mechanism almost no one names clearly enough. Intelligence, in the absence of emotional regulation, becomes a weapon you use against yourself. Your ability to reason becomes your ability to rationalize. Your talent for analysis becomes your talent for finding the 17 reasons why this is not quite the right moment. And it all feels so logical. That's the part that makes it nearly impossible to catch in real time. The fear doesn't announce itself as fear. It arrives dressed in the language of wisdom. I just want to make sure I'm ready. I want to do this right. I don't want to rush something important. And so you wait. And while you wait, life keeps moving. But there's something deeper here. Something that the surface level content about self-sabotage almost never touches, and it lives in the developmental history of anyone who was labeled smart early in life. Think about what that label actually does to a child. When a child is identified as gifted, as exceptional, as the smart one, they receive something extraordinary: love, validation, attention, pride from the adults around them. But they also receive something far more dangerous: a conditional identity. The message, almost never spoken aloud, but absorbed completely at the level of the nervous system, is this: you are valuable because of what you can produce. You are loved because of what you can achieve. And so the self becomes fused with the performance. Intelligence stops being a tool and becomes the core of who you are, which means failure stops being an event and becomes an existential threat. If I fail at this, I am not someone who failed. I am someone who is a failure. And the psyche, which will do almost anything to prevent that verdict, begins constructing elaborate systems of avoidance, not out of laziness, but out of a profound pre-verbal terror of being finally, irrevocably found out. Carl Jung called the repository of what we refuse to see in ourselves the shadow, the unconscious storehouse of everything we buried, because it seemed incompatible with the self we were told to be. For high achievers, the shadow often holds something surprising: the belief that they are, underneath all the accolades, fundamentally ordinary, or worse, fraudulent. Impostor syndrome is not, as it's often discussed, a simple lack of confidence. It is a full-scale psychological defense system, and it does something counterintuitive. It makes the thought of succeeding more threatening than the thought of failing. Because if you succeed, you will be seen. You will be held to that standard. The expectation will rise. And then, inevitably, you will be exposed. So the unconscious mind does the only rational thing it can think of. It ensures you never quite get there. Not because you don't deserve to, but because some part of you, the part that was shaped in childhood long before you had any say in the matter, believes that visibility is danger. This is what makes self-sabotage in intelligent people so maddeningly invisible from the inside. It doesn't feel like self-destruction. It feels like caution. It feels like good judgment, like patience, like standards. It looks, from the outside, like someone who has everything they need and simply isn't using it. But from the inside, it is a system under constant low-grade siege, a psyche that has learned to interpret every opportunity as a potential threat and has become extraordinarily good at neutralizing threats before they can materialize into something that would require you to be fully, vulnerably present in your own life. And none of this is your fault. But that distinction between fault and responsibility is precisely where the real work begins. There is a concept in psychoanalytic theory called the repetition compulsion, and it is one of the most uncomfortable ideas in all of psychology. Uncomfortable, because once you see it operating in your own life, you cannot unsee it. Freud observed that human beings have a mysterious, almost magnetic pull toward repeating patterns that cause them pain. Not because they enjoy the pain, but because the unconscious mind is perpetually trying to master what it could never resolve. The child who grew up in chaos seeks out chaotic relationships as an adult. The person who is abandoned learns, without meaning to abandon themselves first. And the gifted child who was taught that their worth was conditional on their performance grows into an adult who unconsciously recreates, again and again, situations where they are right on the edge of proving their worth, and then steps back. This is not metaphor. This is not self-help language borrowed from a podcast. This is the architecture of a nervous system doing precisely what it was trained to do, running a program written in early childhood, executed in adult life with flawless, devastating consistency. What makes the repetition compulsion so difficult to interrupt is that it doesn't feel like repetition. Each instance feels new, feels chosen, feels justified by the specific circumstances of the present moment. The entrepreneur who self-funds 3 brilliant businesses and quietly kills each one just before launch doesn't experience herself as repeating a pattern. She experiences herself as making the sensible call each time. The market wasn't right, the team wasn't aligned, the timing was off, and each of those reasons may even be partially true. The unconscious is extraordinarily sophisticated. It doesn't fabricate reasons from nothing. It selects from reality, cherry-picks the evidence that supports the conclusion it has already reached, and presents it to the conscious mind as logic. You are not lying to yourself. You are being lied to by yourself. And the liar has access to every memory, every fear, every wound you've ever accumulated. This is why willpower alone is almost useless against self-sabotage. The self-help industry has built an empire on the premise that if you want something badly enough, if you discipline yourself rigorously enough, if you optimize your environment and your habits and your morning routine with sufficient precision, you will override the patterns that are holding you back. And for surface-level habits, the kind rooted in simple inertia or mild discomfort, that can work. But for the deep patterns, the ones that reach back into the emotional bedrock of who you were taught to be, willpower is like trying to reroute a river with your bare hands. You can redirect it for a moment. You can exhaust yourself doing it. But the moment your attention lapses, the moment you're tired or stressed or simply human, the current finds its original path again. What actually interrupts the pattern is something far less glamorous and far more demanding than discipline. It is awareness with compassion, and those two elements are inseparable. Awareness alone, without compassion, produces shame. And shame, which is the feeling of being fundamentally defective as a person, is not a catalyst for change. It is a sedative. Research by June Price Tangney at George Mason University, among others, has consistently found that shame, as distinct from guilt, correlates not with behavioral improvement, but with disengagement, hiding, and the very avoidance behaviors that characterize self-sabotage in the first place. You cannot shame yourself into growth. The psyche does not work that way. Shame tells you that you are the problem, which makes the problem unsolvable, because you cannot amputate yourself. Guilt, by contrast, says I did something that doesn't align with who I want to be. And that distinction carries within it the possibility of change. But even guilt can curdle into something toxic if it's turned inward without direction. What the deep work actually requires is something rarer: the capacity to observe your own patterns with the same quality of curious, non-judgmental attention you might bring to studying something genuinely fascinating in the world. To look at the moment you self-sabotaged, the email you didn't send, the conversation you avoided, the opportunity you rationalized away, and instead of collapsing into self-condemnation or deflecting into intellectualization, to simply ask, what was I protecting? What did that moment feel like? Under the story I told myself about it, and where have I felt that before? That last question is the one that matters most, and it is the one that most people never reach, because getting there requires sitting with discomfort long enough for the real answer to surface. The intelligent mind, trained its whole life to produce answers quickly and confidently, is particularly resistant to this kind of open, patient inquiry. Uncertainty feels like incompetence. Not knowing feels like failure. And so, the mind generates answers fast, plausible ones, articulate ones, ones that can be defended in conversation, and mistakes the speed of the answer for its truth. But the actual psychological roots of self-sabotage are almost never where the first answer points. They're quieter than that, more tender, more specific to a particular face, a particular room, a particular moment in childhood when something was decided about what safety required. There's also something happening in the body that the purely cognitive accounts of self-sabotage miss entirely, and it may be the most practically important piece of all. The body keeps score, to borrow Bessel van der Kolk's now famous formulation. And what that means in this context is that the pattern of self-sabotage is not only stored as a thought or a belief, but as a somatic signature, a particular sensation in the chest when opportunity arrives, a constriction in the throat before you speak, a sudden, sourceless exhaustion that descends the moment a project begins to gain real momentum. These are not random physical events. They are the nervous system communicating in the only language the body has that it has entered familiar territory that once required protection. And because the sensation arrives before the conscious thought, before you have any chance to reason with it, it shapes your behavior from underneath, steering you away from the thing you say you want before the intelligent mind has even had a chance to weigh in. This is why the path out of self-sabotage runs not only through the thinking mind, but through the body itself, and through something even more fundamental than either: the stories you were given about who you are allowed to become. There is a kind of story that gets told in families, not with words exactly, but with silences, with the particular way certain achievements were received and others were ignored, with the emotional temperature of a room when someone dared to want something large. These are the stories that shape the ceiling of what feels psychologically permissible, and they operate so far below the level of conscious awareness that most people spend their entire adult lives bumping against a limit they cannot see and cannot name. Therapists sometimes call this the family loyalty system. What it means, in plain language, is this: there are unspoken rules in every family about who gets to succeed, how much, at what emotional cost to the people left behind. And the intelligent child, who is exquisitely sensitive to the emotional weather of their environment, absorbs those rules completely. Consider the first-generation college student who grew up in a working-class home where education was respected in the abstract, but where anyone who used vocabulary that sounded unfamiliar was quietly mocked around the dinner table, who watched their parents work with their hands, with their backs, and understood at a pre-verbal level that intellectual ambition was somehow a form of betrayal, an implicit accusation that what the family had was not enough. That child may go on to earn a graduate degree, may enter a profession their parents never could have accessed, and may still, 30 years later, find themselves unable to fully inhabit the life they built. They undercharge for their work. They deflect compliments with practiced ease. They tell people they just got lucky. They shrink in rooms where they are clearly the most capable person present, not out of false modesty, but out of a loyalty so old and so deep it has become indistinguishable from identity. To outshine the people you love feels, in the unconscious economy of the psyche, like abandonment, and the psyche will choose almost any form of self-diminishment over the terror of being alone at the top. Psychologists who work with high-achieving clients in depth-oriented traditions have a name for this pattern: upper limiting. The term was popularized by Gay Hendricks, but the phenomenon itself is ancient and nearly universal. The idea is that each person carries an internal thermostat set in childhood, calibrated to the emotional environment of their family of origin, that regulates how much success, joy, love, and visibility feel safe. When life pushes above that setting, the unconscious triggers a correction. Something goes wrong. An argument erupts from nowhere in an otherwise good relationship. A mysterious illness arrives at the moment of a breakthrough. A brilliant person makes an uncharacteristically careless mistake that costs them the opportunity they've spent years working toward. From the outside, it looks like bad luck. From the inside, it doesn't feel like anything. It just feels like life. But it is the thermostat, doing its job, restoring the temperature to the level that feels familiar, which the nervous system has long since confused with the level that feels safe. What makes this so particularly acute for intelligent people is that they are better equipped than most to justify the thermostat's corrections. The internal narrative is always coherent. The reasons are always reasonable. The story always holds together. And because they are articulate enough to convince other people, and more dangerously themselves, the pattern continues for years, sometimes decades, sometimes an entire lifetime, with the person always aware at some vague, uncomfortable level that something is off, but never quite able to locate the source. This is the specific texture of the suffering that most content about self-sabotage fails to capture, because it's not dramatic, it's not a breakdown, it's a slow, quiet, highly intelligent attrition of one's own potential, conducted with full cognitive awareness and near-zero emotional access to the machinery driving it. There's another dimension to this that belongs not just to individual psychology, but to something broader, to the cultural and generational inheritance that shapes what ambition is allowed to look like, particularly for people who came of age in the late 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. This is a generation that was told with remarkable consistency across schools and households and motivational posters that they could be anything, that the only limits were the ones they placed on themselves, that passion was a career strategy and authenticity was a competitive advantage. And then they entered a world that was structurally far more precarious than the one their parents had navigated, with student debt that rewired their relationship to risk, with housing markets that made rootedness feel like a luxury, with a digital landscape that turned every private aspiration into a public performance available for judgment at any moment. This self-sabotage that emerges from this particular cultural formation is distinct in its character. It is not simply about fear of failure in the classical sense. It is about the exhausting, demoralizing gap between the scale of what was promised and the scale of what feels structurally achievable. And the way that gap gets internalized, turned back on the self, converted from a systemic problem into a personal failing. Something must be wrong with me is so much easier to believe than the system I was handed is broken. Not because the former is more accurate, but because the former is something you can theoretically act on. It gives the illusion of agency. It locates the problem somewhere you have at least partial jurisdiction over. And so, an entire generation of highly intelligent, highly educated people find themselves in the peculiar position of self-sabotaging not only their careers, but their capacity to even imagine an alternative. Not from laziness, not from lack of vision, but from a kind of learned helplessness that wears the costume of pragmatism. Jung wrote that what you refuse to make conscious will come to you as fate. It will appear as the relationship that keeps failing in the same way, the opportunity that keeps slipping through the same crack, the version of yourself that is always almost ready but never quite there. The question is not whether these patterns are real. They are ferociously, undeniably real. The question is whether you are willing to look at them with enough honesty and enough gentleness to begin to see not just what you do, but why, at the level where the real answer actually lives. And that answer, when it finally comes, rarely sounds like weakness. It sounds, most often, like someone who learned very early that playing small was the price of belonging, and who has simply, without ever deciding to, kept paying it.